Let's learn how a class can have an object as an attribute within the class. Now you've already seen how to make attributes, strings and ints and floats and doubles, but can an object have an attribute that is another object? Let's go ahead and create a brand new project. File, new project. And we're going to go ahead and choose the console app.NET framework, and we'll call this one object within me. Call it whatever you want. And go ahead and click OK. And it's going to create the brand new project for us, and then we're going to go create a class. And within that class, we're going to specify some attributes. But one of those attributes is going to be a reference to another object. So let's come to the project and right mouse click, and we're going to create a brand new class. Add class. And let's go ahead and create a car class, car.cs. And within that car class, let's add a string attribute, and we'll just call it the name. And we want that to go ahead and be public. And we'll go ahead and add another attribute, int mpg, and we'll make that public. And we don't have to make those public. We could make them protected or private. We could write getters and setters, or use the prop full, P-R-O-P-F-U-L-L, and make properties out of them. And then the other thing I want to do is I'll come back to this class, but let's go create a brand new class. Right mouse click on the project, add class, and this one's going to be engine.cs. And in our engine class, we want to go ahead and specify some information. We're just going to keep it simple, so we're going to go ahead and say public int horsepower as the attribute. Now let's go ahead and go back to our car class, and we want an attribute for the engine in this class. So we can say public engine and call it whatever you want. We'll call it my engine. Now what does this actually mean? This means that it has three attributes associated with the class. A string value called name, an int called mpg, and another one called my engine, which someday is going to hold an engine object. In fact, we could go ahead and write a constructor for this and say public car, because the constructor is the name of the class, and let's go ahead and receive three parameters: string sname, int impg, and engine ong for object. And what we actually want to do here, or better yet, we could even say, you know what, instead of engine, let's go ahead and receive maybe the horsepower, int I horsepower. And now in here we can say this dot name is equal to sname, this dot mpg is equal to impg, and we can say this dot my engine is equal to a new engine object, and we want to go ahead and pass the horsepower parameter to the engine class. Now why do you think it's mad at us? Because it's saying, wait, you don't have a constructor that receives one parameter. Let's go back over to the engine class. The engine class says all I have is my default constructor, so let's go ahead and write one. Public engine int I value. We can call it anything we want, and we can say this dot horsepower is equal to I value. So now what happens when we come back over here to the car class? If we ever make a car object and pass three parameters to it, it will load up the name, the mpg, and then for the engine attribute, which is an engine object, it will go create a brand new engine object by calling the constructor and passing the parameter we received here. That value then gets sent to this constructor, who in turn loads up the horsepower attribute. Let's see how that actually works. So right here we could make a car object. We'll call it ocar equals new car. And remember, I need to pass it 3 parameters. We'll say a mini is the name, and we want the miles per gallon for a Mini Cooper, and we need to pass that as an int. So we'll say we'll pass it the highway value of 38, and then we need to go ahead and pass the horsepower value. We'll go with the higher value, 228. And so now what happens is when we create that car object, we pass those 3 parameters, which go to this constructor. We then set up name, MPG, and horsepower, assign the attribute, assign the attribute, assign the attribute, but in this case, in order to assign the attribute, we need to go make an object by calling the engine constructor and passing this value. We go over to the engine constructor, receive the value, and set the attribute. Let's actually run this and see what happens. First, I'm going to go ahead and print out ocar dot. Let's go ahead and print off all the data. We'll print off the name. We'll do that on one line by itself, and then we'll say ocar dot miles per gallon on a line by itself, and then we'll say let's print off ocar dot my engine, which is an object. So let's go grab the horsepower value for the object for the other object. In other words, the car owns an object. Just think of your body. The body object has a heart inside of it. The heart is also an object. The brain is an object. The eyes are an object. These are objects inside of an object. And that's all we're saying here, that the car has an object inside of the object. Let's go ahead and debug this and see what happens. So we'll go ahead and run it. We set a breakpoint on the constructor. So when we hit that constructor, we should be able to step into that next line and see what happens with the values being passed. So here we are at that line. We said create the object, and in order to do that, you call the car constructor and you pass 3 parameters. Let's step into it. Mini goes into S name, 38 to MPG, 228 to horsepower. Let's go ahead and step, 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 step. This now says call the engine constructor and pass it whatever IHP had. Step. Now we go to the engine constructor. 228 goes into I value, and we take I value and assign it to horsepower, and that constructor, and that constructor, and now we can just start printing off the data. And if I print off horsepower, come back over to the screen, we should be able to see Mini 38 228. And that's because this says print off the horsepower in the engine in the car. Now, what else can we do with this? This is exciting, right? We can put objects inside of objects. That's how the real world works. A computer is an object. A processor is an object inside of the object. A processor is on the motherboard, which is inside the computer. So the computer owns or has a motherboard, and the motherboard has a processor. It also has memory. A car has an engine. A car has tires. A car has lots of different objects, right? So that's how objects actually work. So how could we do that and specify maybe the car has an object? Well, or multiple objects. Let's go back to cars. The car class, we know it has a name, an MPG, and an engine. We know the engine has horsepower, and maybe the car has something else. Let's go to the class, right mouse click the class, and choose Add Class. And this time we want to type in the class tire.cs. Now within the tire, we want to go ahead and specify something about tires. And with tires, let's just specify a size. So we'll say public string size. And that will be the attribute. Let's go ahead and make a constructor. Public tire string size. And in this case, we'll say this dot size is equal to, well, let's change the name of that so we avoid any problems. We're okay because we use the word this, but we'll say S size. And here we'll say S size. So we made a brand new class called tire, has one attribute called size, and we made a constructor for it. Let's come back over to the car and let's add a new attribute to the car. We'll say public, and how many tires do cars have? Well, it all depends on the car. Mini Coupe has 4, but maybe there's cars that only have 3 tires. For instance, I remember back when I lived in Argentina, we had Citroën cars and they only had 3 tires. Or maybe the new, I think it's the Elio or Elio that only has 3 tires. Or maybe it's a motorcycle that we feel looks like a tire, but I mean a car, but it's a motorcycle. But we'll go ahead and call it a car, and they only have 3 tires. I think the Polaris, or maybe we're going to make a brand new one, become billionaires. And so what we want to do, we don't really know how many tires the car will have. So we're going to go ahead and make a list of tire. We'll call it list tires. That'll be the attribute. And we don't really know how many tires we're going to have yet. So what we can do here now is we can create another constructor. And let's say that in this constructor, we'll overload it. And we're going to add two more parameters. Int will be inum tires, and then a string, that'll be S tires. And so down here, what we want to do now, we'll set up a variable iCount, and we're going to make a for loop for iCount is equal to 0, and as long as iCount is less than the inum tires, iCount plus plus, we're going to drop into the object and say this dot list tires, because that's our attribute, which is a list of tire objects. See right here, we said it's going to be a list of tire objects. And we want to go ahead and do an add, and we want to add a new tire object, and we want to pass it the tire description, S tires. So let's explain this one more time. We said the attribute is called list tires, and it's going to be a list of tire objects. We don't know how many though. And then in the constructor, the overloaded constructor, we say let's pass it how many tires it has and what is the description for those tires. And in the actual constructor, we'll say let's create a loop, and for the number of tires they said they had, let's go make a new tire object by calling the tire constructor, pass the description to it, and so by the time we're done, we're going to have multiple tire objects associated with that car. Let's come back over our tire class, and we do have that set up correctly, and we'll come to here, and let's go ahead and add the Mini Cooper has 4 tires, and the type of tire that the Mini Cooper has, there's a bunch of different tires we could choose from with Mini Cooper, but let's go ahead and say that it is a string, and it's going to be the 205/45-17 tire. So that's the description. Now, what do I want to do here? I want to go ahead and create or have those tires be created for us. And so if I come back to the car class, it says, yeah, don't worry, I'm going to make all those tire objects for you. Let's see if it actually works though. Let's come back to here and let's create a brand new variable, int iCount, and we'll make a loop that says for iCount is equal to 0, and as long as iCount is less than the car's list of tires count, then we want to go ahead and come into here and we'll print off each of those tires that the car has. ocar.listTires bracket iCount bracket dot, and let's print the size off. And let's see what happens. Let's go ahead and watch it in the debugger, and then we can explain what's going on. We'll start it, and we drop into here. Let's go do the constructor. Num tires is 4. There's the description. We'll go ahead and jump over all these. We already know this works. That creates our engine object by calling the engine constructor. We drop into this loop, and it says, is the count less than the number of tires? Yes, it is. Drop into here. Let's go call the tire constructor and make a tire object, and we're going to pass the description of the tire. We drop into the tire constructor. We take the size. We add it to the size attribute for that object, and then we add the object to the list owned by the car. Now in this case we have our error and it says a null reference, and that's because when you look at how the list was declared, it said make a list of tires, but that was never instantiated. So we need to come back up in here, and we don't need to make objects for it yet and add elements, but remember, when you make a list you have to say that's a new list, and you have to call the list constructor for that tire. Now the list actually exists. So if we run this one more time, we're going to get back into our class, and let's drop into that constructor and we'll execute it. Now we have a list object, count 0. We drop into this constructor. We know all those works. That makes the engine object. We're inside the for loop. Now let's go get the list, add a new value to it, make an object, and store that to it. Let's see if it works. We drop over into the constructor, change the attribute, add the object. Add the object. Add the object, and one more time, add the object. So now, by the time I'm done, my car has an attribute called tires, and it has 4 objects, tire objects, and each one of them with the size description. And they could have been different values. It'd be a crazy car, but you could do that. And so now when I drop into here, I can now say, hey, let's go print off all of the tires we have. Go to the car object, go to the list of tire objects in the car object, access the first tire object, and get its size. So that's what we're doing here. Access the first tire object in the car object and print off its size. Get the next tire object, get the next tire object, and the next tire object. And so when we look at our output, we see that there's the name, miles per gallon, horsepower, which comes from the engine object in the car, and then the 4 tire objects in the car object. What else could we do with this? Let's do one more quick one. Let's go ahead and go back to the engine object. And what else do engines have that you could work with within a car? Let's say that the engine itself has something inside of it that's objects. So let's go ahead and go create a brand new class. Add class. And in this case, we're going to say it's called the valve class. And we're going to say that it has a public string, and we'll just call it a name. I am not a mechanic, as you can probably tell. Let's go back over to the engine In fact, before we do that, let's make a constructor, public valve, and we'll receive a string s_name, and we'll just say this dot valve, or this dot name, is equal to s_name, which would be the type of the valve. Go back to engine, and what could we do in the engine class now? Now remember, engines can have a different number of valves. So in this case, let's go ahead and say this dot, and we want to actually work with a valve. We need to make a property first. Come back up to here. We'll say we have a public list, and it'll be a valve. We'll call it my valves equals, and remember you have to say new list valve constructor, and we can say that this engine receives another parameter, and we'll say it's int inum valve. Let me get the spelling correctly. Int inum valve and string s valve description. And then right here, what we can do, int icount, and we can say for icount is equal to 0 as long as icount is less than the number of valves that we want to make. Icount plus plus. Then we can actually come in here, and for that attribute called myValves, which is a list, we can do an add, and we can add a brand new valve object. And in that valve object, we want to pass it the valve description. And so that could now go and load up all the valve objects in the engine object in the car object. And right here, let's go ahead and change that constructor. Not only do we need to receive the tires, but now we need to receive the number of valves and a string for the valve description. And then in this constructor itself, when we make the engine object, we now need to pass it I number of valves, and we need to pass it the S valve description. So let's see how this actually works. Come back to here, let's go to the program. Let's change the constructor. We need to add more parameters. We'll say that the Mini Cooper has 4 valves, and the description of the valve is fast. That's a great valve description, isn't it? So let's go ahead and run the program. Oh, we have some errors, so let's go fix our errors first. And the error is the fact that this constructor calls this engine constructor, which only has 1 parameter. But if you notice, we only have 1 constructor over here, so that's not going to work. So what we can do, just for the sake of time on this video, let's just comment out this constructor. So we only have 1. Now we have the 1 constructor we've been working with that receives the name, miles per gallon, the horsepower, the number of tires, the description of the tires, the number of valves, and the valve description. Let's go ahead and run it one more time, and let's see what happens. We drop into this object, drop into the constructor. Here we set up the list of tires. Now we drop into this constructor, and we start executing the code until we hit the engine constructor, which we now pass the horsepower, the number of valves, and the valve description. Let's drop into that constructor. We create the list. We now call the constructor, and we say set the horsepower, and for the number of valves we have, go make a brand new valve object, stick it in the engine. Brand new valve object, stick it in the engine. In fact, let's watch the constructor. Brand new valve object, stick it in the engine, and one more brand new valve object, calling the constructor, sticking that in the engine. We come back to the car, and then the car sets up all the tires, which you've already seen. So we're going to go ahead and just set a breakpoint back over to here when we go to print things out, and we'll continue it. Let's take a look at the car object. The car object now has the miles per gallon, the name, the list of tires with the tire object in each one of the list of tires, an engine object which has the horsepower, and the engine object also has a list of valves which have valve objects. And that's how you can make objects within objects, a list of objects within objects within objects, and now your mind is totally blown. Practice that. Hope you understand it.